Welcome everyone to our first workshop of the third part of the series for P.A.D.E. Our workshop today, it's called the Digital Value Chain. It's going to be lasting 90 minutes. And I'm going to pass this on to Inga. For anyone who needs to access the recording of the show, I'm going to post the link to the workshop, to the slides that you can see in the chat as well.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Andrea. Good to see you again. What we're talking about, in this sort of short series of additional conversation is all about digital business models and sort of emerging Canadian digital initiatives in the performing arts that are helping us think about what arts organizations might do in terms of generating new ways of being in the world that go beyond sort of the physical, in the physical realm of the live arts and performance. So I've prepared a few things for us to sort of look at together and talk about, to try to actually understand how this digital world is maybe different than the physical world, and figure out what it is to actually generate revenue out of that. So one of the things that business model implies is a transfer of value. You get to see a show, I get to pay you money for that. Right, in return there's a value exchange that happens. That's really quite important to think about. You may have realized quickly when COVID hit that there was an awful lot of free digital artistic work available almost instantaneously. Now, I totally understand why this happened. I also happen to believe that it's actually a long-term detrimental thing to the art sector. So it happened because artists and audiences were seeking connection. Right? That's what that was all about. And we didn't necessarily worry at the end of March in 2020 what the quality of any of those experiences were. Bad lighting, sound, ho-hum sound out of people's, living rooms that had never contemplated setting up a studio like that at home, right? So the quality was not even that important in those first few weeks, but it quickly became important, didn't it? So I'm not sure how many shows you still watch that aren't a really great quality, only in order to connect with artists or artistic expression, right? I'm guessing there's been a shift. You might still do some of it. I do too sometimes, but it's become a lot harder pitch. Quite frankly, I prefer a Netflix video movie over badly produced or haphazardly produced, shows online. So this is a real challenge, right? So we started out getting into this work in an under-resourced way, not fully understanding all of the intricacies of what digital production actually looks like, learning as we go all together. So in a way, this is the most exciting of times. In another way, in hindsight, I'm kind of going like, there would have been a better approach, but we didn't have time for that better approach, right? So I'm back at trying to talk to colleagues across, the arts and across Canada about how do we live online in a way that actually supports artists, that supports arts organizations. Part of what support means is not that I show up for free as an audience member, but that I offer you an exchange of value. So we just have a few people in the room right now, but I was curious to ask you a question in terms of what you believe a business model is, in fact, at its core. There's lots of definitions of that. So it's not like there's a right answer or a definitively right answer. But I'm just curious, for the three of you, if any one of you might want to chime in on what is a business model trying to articulate.
I'll be like very economic and general about it, but
sure.
A business model is a way how a business generates revenue. So how does a business earn? A method and a way, an approach to generating revenue.
Yeah, that's at the core of it, that's exactly what it is. Now, even though many arts organizations are not for profit, you still have a business model, right? Because money comes in and money goes out, right? Absolutely, it does. Um, how that happens is a really important thing to sort of reflect on a little bit. In general terms, in normal times, how would you have described the business model of the performing arts? How does money come in? How does money go out?
Based on, I'm slightly cheating because I actually, when I started doing this, bought this book, 50 business models or something like that people have created for
Yeah.
IT startups, but that helped me define it. I think the traditional business model for performing arts is direct to consumer retail, basically, or service. This is where we're kind of, are we a service or are we a retailer? And a subscription model, if a company has a subscription.
Yeah. And what is subscription all about?
It's basically generating revenue now that would be happening in the future. So it's basically a matter of cash flow where your future value is generated now, and that represents an investment that allows you to create new products.
And in addition to that, you know, it's those who do subscribe are considered to be committed to the organization, right? So there is that. So it addresses the customer relationship piece, or it tries to address the customer relationship piece. In actual fact, I often find that, you know, many subscription programs are actually incredibly transactional, and they're really just predicated on the cash flow issue. And perhaps, if you're lucky, a more efficient marketing process. I can sell 6 shows at once as opposed to 1 at a time, right? So there's a few benefits for that. I'm curious if there's some other thoughts about that business model. I think it's true. You know, it seats in a night. It's like an airplane. You know, when that night is gone, those seats are gone if they were sold or not. Right. So there's a lot of logistics that arts organizations, who are presenting organizations, venue-based organizations, they spend a lot of time making sure the hall looks good, even if the sales aren't great. Right. It's what we call papering the hall. Just to actually have a great show actually requires an audience. Right. So there's a lot of mechanisms that go into actually making that work. Now, most arts organizations don't actually start with having shows to sell. Right. Most of the arts organizations start with doing enough work to become eligible for public funding, which becomes, for all intents and purposes, your startup funding, right? Whether that's based on a project or whether that's based on, you know, you're mature enough to be in operating grant streams. And depending on the province that you're in or the territory that you're in, operating grants can be very helpful, or they can be so slim that they can actually become unhelpful. Right. So some of you, I think, are in that experience in Ontario sometimes, where there's just not enough resources acknowledged for the administrative aspects of the work to actually make things go. And a lot of the investment wants to be in creation and dissemination right away. Right. So there is that way in which the business model for the live performing arts, you know, it hasn't really evolved in a really long time. You know, way back in the day, I don't know, I'm thinking Mozart now, way back in the day, patronage would have been the primary business model for performing arts. Patronage by, you know, the powers that be, or well-off, you know, merchants, right? And the audience role would have been quite different than it is today, right? So there has been evolution, but, you know, in terms of how money comes in and how money gets spent, right? But it's at heart in Canada at this time, there really hasn't been a lot around trying to sort of make a real dent in sort of understanding that for the last 20, how many years has it been? 28 years, there has been a thing called the internet. And in many sectors of the economy, the internet has been an incredibly disruptive force. So adjacent cultural industries like book publishing were one of the first affected. News production, news media, incredibly affected almost instantly. Anybody remember why book publishing was rapidly affected right away? back in 1994, 1995? Which company was founded in 1994? Amazon.
Wow.
Amazon was initially the bookseller online. Their plan was to revolutionize retail, and without argument, they have done that to a large extent by now, right? But the first sector they targeted was book publishing, in terms of selling books to a public. And they did that without a warehouse, right? They just had direct delivery. It was a very interesting model, direct delivery from the publisher to the consumer, cutting out the bookstore. They didn't have to warehouse the books. What did that allow them to do? They could carry every book in print. So a bookstore might carry between 6,000 and 20,000 titles. The books in print at that point in time, English language books in print, would have been probably 1.5 million. Right? So that scaling up is crazy, right? So, and we may have noted, one of the things I want to point out about this is there were lots of booksellers in the 90s that were very, very large. Chapters, Coles in Canada, they emerged around that time. In the US, it would have been Borders bookstores, massive chain. Neither one of those organizations ever pulled off an online store, anything equivalent to what Amazon pulled off. Why is that? Right? There's this intrinsic, this is a trick question. There's this intrinsic challenge when your entire business model is predicated on bricks and mortar. Infrastructure that goes with bricks and mortar is very different from digital. The kind of expertise you need, the kind of staffing you need, very different in a bricks and mortar, bookstore than it is in a mail order business, which is what Amazon essentially was. Self-serve, yes, I browse in a bookstore, but self-serve online actually is pretty different, right? All of a sudden, I can have recommendations from other readers, for instance. I don't get that when I browse in a bookstore. I just get the back cover copy and what the staff tells me. Or maybe what the major papers tell me about the top 10 lists in various genres, right? So the dynamics are really, really different. And time and again, we see that the startups being digital organizations intrinsically do better than bricks and mortar organizations trying to adapt to a digital world. This is a problem for us. Andrea, I think you had a hand up a moment ago.
It's touching on what you're actually talking about right now, of the problem of how can theater disrupt or change its business model. Because in Amazon's case, or in any other industry that got disrupted through digital means, it did that because it cut out certain services in the middle and increased productivity as a result of that, right? It's like no need to pay the lease anymore for the warehouse, no need to pay the workers working in the warehouse. But in theater, the issue is going back to Mozart or to Shakespeare's time. You still need the same amount of actors than in Shakespeare's times today. You cannot read by just reducing the number of people in the play. It doesn't make the model well, it does make the model cheaper, but it's not the same piece. But taking theater into the digital, it actually makes the model more expensive, because now you need the same 12 actors on stage, you need the same director, costume designer, but you also need people who run the cameras, who edit, who market, who run the web. So you actually make theater more expensive rather than cheaper in the digital world.
Well, and the other issue that you're facing as a theater company is, how is this not just becoming a movie?
Very important, yeah.
Right, because one of the challenges you have is, and that's why quality is such an issue in that initial iteration when everybody rushed online for connection, not perfection, right? As a colleague of mine would say, connection always trumps perfection. But it doesn't in the long run when I can just watch movies, right? I can watch Shakespeare. There's movies. There's all kinds of movies, all kinds of renditions, just like in theater. And by the way, I'm sure you've all seen the, single person Hamlet, where one person actually has all the roles. And it's a formidable feat, to actually accomplish that. Is that an artistic choice? What I like to ponder in that scenario was, is that an artistic choice to have made? Or is it a choice really driven by the lack of economies of scale that theater faces? Just like there's very little touring theater in Canada. There's very little touring dance in Canada because it's so prohibitively expensive. So what ends up touring are very small shows, very simple sets, not a lot of shipping, not a lot of, right? It's the actors mostly with things that maybe they can actually, you know, sort of get when they show up in your town. So very, very low profile. I'm more likely to see awesome Canadian dance companies in Europe than I am to see them outside of their home city in Canada, right? Because there's a different format and a different on that continent over there that encourages arts and culture in a completely different way. So those are really significant challenges, right? I'm wondering, and Aline, you may have some things to say about this too, so feel free to chime in just because you're here. But the other piece I was wondering, the other question I had for you as part of this conversation is, so what are viable business models for independent artists or for small arts companies, arts producing companies, to actually make a decent living, to actually get enough revenue to sustain yourself? What would you consider to be the viable business models today for that?
I think if using the digital world experiment, we're in a phase of experimentation with that technology right now, I think. But there are some companies who have done progress and made shows that incorporate digital technology or different technologies, but still keep it as a theater show. I think outside the March has done the show where they called you and you kind of had like different people calling you as a part of the show. So it's like using technology, but the narrative and the way how the plot is built is still live. It's changeable. What are some of the characteristics of the theater? You still have a role as an audience member that is active in a way. The really protocol in Europe has been doing this for some time, where its audience is engaged in a different way through technology and allows smaller shows. So it's one or two creators that are behind the show, but then the show travels to different places. It operates with local artists rather than traveling the whole show and the sets and the artists and the tech. So there have been attempts done like this that started happening a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Aline, anything you want to add there first?
I think, well, there's a model here that's seemingly quite successful as Inner Chamber, which is a small chamber ensemble concert series here that was being quite successful with a dinner, restaurant, and presentational model of a series of, I can't remember, 6-10 concerts a year. And I just saw their work recently again, and they, I think, have managed that sort of balance of quite high quality filming capacity, multi-camera, multi-shot situation in a restaurant situation. So you have the restaurant live experience of the eating meal experience, and you have an engagement with a well shot it's music dominantly or talking, reading. It's not a play situation, but it is theatrical. That particular one was quite theatrical in the sense of the content. And they have the capacity of a 48-hour turnaround on demand situation that allows additional revenue, and they have an interview situation that gives you a little bit of an added value opportunity and an advanced engagement thing. So, and I think you had spoken in some other context to how music is able to do this somewhat more effectively because of the difference between theater and the live performing arts entity. And so I do think it is that part of it, the exchange. How do you have a live engagement with it? And I think I mentioned in another context a company called Mind of a Snail, which was at the beginning of last year, but they were already a shadow puppet company that was already playing with light and form and engagement. And they moved fairly directly into multiple computers being front of house and audience interactive in the moment you bonk on your thing, and they have a live in the moment reaction for the players at the other end. Again, very, very small company, and a fairly small entity here that are able to explore and have a fair amount of agility. I think various of the other puppet entities certainly in Canada have been extremely resistant of putting anything on because it's just so far from the model and puppetry. So some small companies and small entities and slams and stuff like that are doing a small enough singular thing that it does translate reasonably well into this digital world, but
yeah. And one of the things that we've talked about before is this idea of music. Music was digitized. Music became a media-based asset in the early 1900s. You remember those wax cylinders and all that? And then radio appeared. So all of a sudden I could listen to music in a completely disembodied way, and it was a very satisfying experience from a listener standpoint, right? So that sector has sort of been digitized because its primary asset is sound waves. The primary asset in dance and theater and puppetry is a physical, kinetic, three-dimensional entity. And it's, so to do a radio play, right, it's a completely different thing from what it would be to do, which, obviously they exist and they're fun too. But it's a completely different entity from what a theater on stage actually is, or what a play on stage actually is and feels like, right? One of the challenges has been, in terms of not really going there for the sector, for those more, embodied art forms, intrinsically embodied art forms, is that computer screens are notoriously two-dimensional. So we're all just watching movies of each other. Basically, right? I mean, even if it's like, even today, right now, the experience that those in the Zoom room live have is markedly different from what will happen for those of you who watch this after the fact. Right? Because even here, there is a kinetic energy that you just don't get when you watch it after the fact, right? You end up watching a movie, and your level of engagement is that of watching a movie, and you'll fast forward through the uninteresting parts because that's what we do. It's normal. It actually makes sense. So I'm not going to dwell on this right now, but I think one of the things we need to understand is that there is a near future where computers aren't going to be two-dimensional screens. There's a lot of visionary work happening in technology to get us out of computers as two-dimensional screens. So one of the questions I would love for people to think far more diligently about is, what do we need to do now to be ready for that world? Because if there's a big opportunity there that others with other skill sets will absolutely take advantage of. Right now we're competing with video games more than you compete with the arts organizations, in the 150-kilometer catchment of where you are in Stratford. That includes Toronto, right? You're not really competing there. You're competing with those other alternatives. And they will fill in those spaces. Others will fill in those spaces if we don't go there. So that is a sort of an interesting question that still hangs there. I'm going to share my screen with you for a bit here, and so that'll change both of your realities here into a full screen mode for you. But you can change it if you want to for yourselves. I wanted to I want to talk a little bit about business models, innovations, and extensions before COVID. None of this is a secret. That this has all been going on. So what does a festival do if it realizes that it needs to be top of mind year round because people forget about you? Well, you adopt year-round programming. You might do those 6 shows a year that just keep you in touch with your market. Or maybe you realize that education, despite all its misgivings about having enough funding, actually has funding to put artists into schools, to put shows into schools, maybe to entire auditoriums at a time, not classrooms, right? So there's actually lots of opportunity in school programming that some festivals have been embracing. Fantastic work, right? That's essentially an extension of the business model of what a festival does. We see independent artists. One of the most viable ways that an independent artist has working in the arts to make a good living is to teach. So there's tons of teaching artists who are also producing work, who might also be playwrights, who might also be actors, who might also be dancers or choreographers, right? But where you actually make a living is in teaching. Lots of trained artists end up in administration, not doing necessarily both, right? Not being the artistic director who's also the managing director, but literally just, I trained as a theater artist for a bunch of reasons. I decided that, my career is going to lead me into management or functions around theater instead of making theater. Those are all viable ways, you know, to actually have a vibrant and growing sector. The reason why these things are happening sometimes is problematic, though, right? It's because your ability to sustainably operate year over year over year is in fact incredibly difficult, right? We see local theaters turning to touring sometimes, theater companies, I should say, turning to touring to expand the market, while I've seen, you know, touring musicians become house bands in specific venues, so they never have to travel anymore. And, you know, both of those, sometimes it's not that, you know, it's not that there's a model that works for everybody equally, it's that whatever you've been doing, you might be challenged in, and then you're going to do something else. And it doesn't matter that it's not innovative per se, in the sense of it's never happened before in quite that way. It does, and it has, but you haven't done it that way. And now you're, you know, need to build those new kind of relationships. You need to build those new kind of approaches to your market, right? And you need to add that to your repertoire. Most theaters have, you know, there's many municipal theaters, for instance, have art galleries. So they're crossing art forms. We see lots of theaters who are putting on all kinds of, you know, like you can rent their venue, you can have your wedding in there, you can have corporate events in there, you can do all kinds of non-arts things to help them generate and like to actually fill their days and nights to capacity, right? These are all just ways, these are off topic, kind of off arts, off business model in a sense from an artistic standpoint, but intrinsically important to actually make ends meet at the end of the day. I know organizations where the real revenue comes from their parking garage. Because guess what? If you're a downtown venue in a half decent sized city, most of the people who will park there during the day are working in offices. They're used to paying good money for parking downtown, right? So you can generate way more money in these off arts activities sometimes, and that's great because it helps you to do what you're actually meant to do, right? But those are all ways in which people are, you know, have been working around figuring out how they can navigate all of these various ways of diversifying revenue, building more and more relationships on top of actually doing artistic work, artistic production, and getting that in front of audiences, which arguably as an arts organization, that's all you really want to do. Right? And yet, you know, we keep distracting you because it's an under-resourced sector, right? So this is right. Any comments on any of that other than recognition?
The desire to cry.
The desire to cry.
Weep is another word.
Weep. Weep is a good word. That's so much deeper. Right. So when I'm proposing this conversation about business digital value chains in the arts, I know that this is actually bad news in many ways, right? Because it feels like there's yet somebody else that's getting you off mandate in a way, right? Your mandate is to produce art, to do whatever things you want to do around that, and to get it in front of audiences. It just so happens that it's becoming extremely difficult now to get in front of audience if you don't consider those additional channels, if you don't consider that additional world. Andrea, did you have a comment that was on your mind as well?
Yeah, you really made me think about, you know, how much the appearance of the digital world, like in what way does it disrupt theater? Because I think it forces all of us back to the drawing board to define what is theater in the first place. Because like you mentioned, gaming or virtual reality, yes, it is live, but you know, it's also two-dimensional, but well, virtual reality is not two-dimensional. So it does bring us as theater artists first and foremost to the question of redefining what is theater. I think that has to become the number one question before we jump into what technology we'll use. Sure, experimentation in that and learning in the technology is also important, but the key question is, what is theater in comparison to all of these? What makes theater theater? Because I think that has changed profoundly now. It's no longer just, well, it's live and it's interactive. Well, that's game. Right, it's live and interactive.
Right, but was theater ever interactive? I think some theater has been, you know, very interactive and really drawing on audiences in creating that those pieces. And I'm not even talking about improv here, right? Just something's just designed that way. But a lot of theater is essentially, I'm sitting in a darkened hall. I don't get to talk to my neighbor. I'm very traditional in this description, right? I don't get to talk to my neighbor. I better not, cough too much, right? And my focus is outside of myself to the front of the room, right? Where it's almost like watching a movie, except it's live, right? So I think depending on what you've been doing, the question isn't what is theater, but the question might be more about what is the connection I want to foster with my audience and what are the conversations I want to engender. And using theatrical form to do that, right? Because the question of what is theater is like as unanswerable as a definitive, here is the one definition, right? As the question of what is music. We don't ask what is music. We just know what we like and what we don't like as listeners. Right? And when you give me an atonal scale, I am going to be, my skin will crawl. 10% of the population loves that kind of music. Right? Yeah. Some of us, you hear metal and you just want to run screaming. And for others, that is the thing, right? All music is a bunch of sound waves. If I was to reduce music to what music is, right? Am I still having a useful conversation? A while back, I was working with storytellers, and they were very distracted because storytelling, like puppetry, perhaps, it tends to be associated with children, which in both cases is not, in fact, an accurate thing at all. That is just one part of what these art forms do. So they were very distracted by trying to explain what storytelling is, and I was baffled. Like, what is storytelling? It's not a useful question. Storytelling, like puppetry, they're some of the oldest artistic expressions we have as humans, right? They're intrinsic. We don't have to explain it. but maybe the question is, what is the story we want to generate? What is the conversation we want to have? Some of us are into, theater for social change, for instance. What is the change we want to see in the world, and how, through our practices, do we support that? That is quite a different question, right? And to me, when I approach it that way, part of what happens is I'm not tethered to live performance in a physical kinetic space. But I'm also challenged by recognizing that, gee, a lot of what I might be producing doesn't look and feel like theater the way I understood it.
I think the piece that's still missing in that, though, is the act of a large number or even a modest number of humans in the same room actually breathing simultaneously is something that is completely different about live performance, even if it's in that proscenium dark room situation. When people breathe together, and the actual visceral sensation of mutual energy in response to a thing. I think that's why people like sport, right? You can go and all yell together at a thing. There's some community physical in the presence of other humans that was taken over by religion previously, and there is a limited situation depending on the person where that
there's certainly been
connection.
Changes in that, absolutely. Yeah, I think that is very true. And I think we see that with 2 years into COVID and sort of the degrees of isolation we've all experienced. We see the impacts on mental health. We see the impacts on, finding your tribe and becoming very polarized because you joined that tribe and that becomes the only truth, very religious-like. We see that in some of the movements, playing out over the last 2 years very clearly. And so we know that, humans, we are a herd animal. We need each other. We really do. And to only experience that in a mediated way, that's better than nothing, but is not nearly as good as being in the same space. This is where, the graphic you're looking at on screen might come in, right? Because I'm not actually proposing at all that our digital future is devoid of live performance in a space with real humans sitting beside each other in close proximity, right? But what I am proposing is that in this digital future, or a digital present for that matter, that the live performance is just one aspect of what your sector, your industry, right, the performance producing industry or sector does. So as opposed to simply seeding the digital space to other skill sets, to other sectors, to other people, I am proposing that in this digital future, the pie changes, and that, you know, performance producing companies of any sort can in fact figure out, and might need to figure out, how you relate to the physical and the digital worlds. One of the things that also happens is my expectation as an audience member coming to your shows or coming to your venue, my expectations of the experience is shifting because of digital, right? So even if we're still meeting and breathing together and experiencing something together and having each our reactions to that thing in front of us, you know, I might actually expect a level of engagement all of a sudden that you never had to deal with. I might expect a before show experience that is quite different from just a lecture before a show, or an after show experience that might feel qualitatively different from what a typical artist talkback might have been. Right. And those are good formats, right? Those are, because that's a two-way street. Right. The two-way interaction is what part of what we aspire to. You know, so I think so to me, this is still an interesting question that is still hanging out there, you know, 2 years after COVID started and forced us into this world exclusively, right? Because most of us couldn't sort of do anything significant in person. But we're catching up. You know, video games exist and all of that cool stuff, and we have this ability to you know, consume from an audience standpoint. I have an ability to spend my 24 hours in the day in a lot of alternative ways, right? So the competitive set is really different that you're dealing with digitally. This is important to think about. I want to talk about the digital value chain in a moment, but I thought I'll show you this graphic here. I didn't make this. Mr. Ansoff made this graphic back in the 60s, I think, an economist. And it basically just talks about markets and products in a very simplistic, you know, 2x2 matrix kind of a way. And, you know, the easiest thing to do for all of us is to have an existing market and an existing product or service, and to simply generate, excuse the terminology, deeper market penetration. So I want my existing audience not to come once a year, but to come 6 times a year. I want them to bring their kids, right? That's simply market penetration. So extracting more revenue out of the exact same market, doing the exact same thing. But that's where the subscription model came from, essentially. Then there is this, I got my market, the same people I want to reach, but I'm going to give them some new experiences. The festival turns into a 6-concert series or a 6-show series in addition to, or something like that, right? But you're still dealing with your existing market, as opposed to, I want to change, you know, I want to change something, and I'm now addressing a new kind of market, a new kind of audience. So I do school shows, for instance. I figured out how to get into that world. So my product is existing. The audience is changing dramatically. Right. So those, you know, so when you change one dimension, I either, you know, do what I do, but I add market segments, or from the same market, I add a product. Right. That is much easier than anything that ends up in that other quadrant called diversification. When we talk about digitization in the live arts, you are absolutely in the diversification quadrant, the most difficult of them all, because you realize quickly back in March 2020, as soon as you went online, you realize quickly that there is actually a different audience for this, and that audience has different expectations. So there is an overlap. Some of your existing people would have come, but you would have also found a new market, or they would have found you for some reason. And the product itself, the service itself, actually feels really different, and it requires a completely different production process, right? So so what happens, and why diversification often fails, is because it is incredibly expensive. Because it assumes you keep doing the thing you've been doing as you're adding this diversification of the thing you're doing, right? Incredibly hard. I hope this is a useful concept to help us understand a little bit of what the challenge actually is. Is that is that useful? I see some nods. Thank you. Thank you for affirming. So here's the typical value chain in the live arts. Creators create, producers produce, presenters present. This is your normal format. A presenter may or may not have a venue. A presenter may or may sometimes be a producer. Like you have a lot of self-presenting arts organizations, for instance, right? Then you end up in a venue of some sort. And you do all of this stuff to get to a patron, a paying audience member. Whether they pay themselves or whether you have a sponsor that pays the bill doesn't really matter, or whether you have a public funder that pays the bill, right? But what you're trying to get to is the patron. So basically, the most simplistic way to describe this is art moves up that line and revenue moves down that line. Do you have any observations about how this is a really challenging model for the person at the beginning of that process, the creators? Any observations that anybody wants to share at all about how money moves down that line?
Why is there a distinction between a creator and a producer? Isn't a producer also a creator?
It depends. So if I am the playwright, I wrote the play. I'm Shakespeare. I'm a playwright. I write the play. While I was alive, I produced my own stuff, absolutely. But now I'm not. So now a producing theater company, or maybe a dance company, or maybe a ballet will take my script, right? And they will produce an experience. So there is a distinction between the two. Just like a choreographer may or may not be a dancer who performs themselves. They may just be a choreographer. So yes, you're both creating things.
Yeah.
But a playwright doesn't produce plays. A theater company does, right? So while they can be the same people, they're actually different functions.
So in Europe, it's not, there is no distinction. So a theater company is also a creator, but the difference between a playwright writing the play is that is considered literature, not theater. You can have playwrights writing plays and have them in their drawer, because that play, that drawer is still a work of art, but it's a different genre. It's not theater. Then it's literature because it lives on the page.
It lives on the page.
Here I find that this distinction causes a lot of problems. A choreographer is the creator. Without the choreographer, dancers can do pretty much nothing.
Oh, absolutely. But it's a dance company that ends up producing that work that sets that choreography onto the human body, right? And sometimes those like Marie Chouinard, a fantastic choreographer, also a company in her own name, all of that. So it's one entity, in fact, but the functions still are in fact separate functions. Similar with composers, lots of music in theater, right? But the composition gets published in music publishing, similar to what you're describing in playwriting. So there is a whole other process, there's a whole other business line that some of those folks can actually leverage, can actually make a living at, quite separate from the live performance, right? Like I can make, if my composition gets recorded, I'm now in the recording business, in the recorded music business, which is very different from the live arts business, with completely different revenue streams attached to it. My stuff all of a sudden gets played on radio, right? So in the Canadian system, we tend to distinguish a little bit between these functions, even if sometimes they are one and the same person. In small organizations, they're invariably one and the same person, all the way to the presenter. And often at the venue level, you end up having to figure out where you do your thing. So you might rent a space or something like that, right? In larger organizations, these are very distinctive people, in fact. Eileen, you having a...
I think the other part of way money is broken down in Canada per se is the act of creation is funded, and the be it a playwright or a creator of a piece of work and art that is then taken to somewhere to be produced. So those are they are different funding streams within certain aspects of funding, and depending on the entity, sometimes, for instance, we actually facilitate someone creating something in a production situation, but they also can be separate as far as funding entities go.
And you end up commissioning work, basically, right? Where you say, hey, I like your stuff, I want you to write a thing for me, and we'll figure out how to get that paid for. And it's essentially a commissioning process, right? Now, sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
The process of how these things are, the terminology in Canada works is very confusing for immigrants, because this is not how it works anywhere else in the world. And these distinctions between one and another, like everywhere around the world, people commission work and you pay people to write something, to compose something. That's perfectly normal. But the distinguishing difference between creator and a producer, I think here it creates a subclass of people who are creators, who now have to go after to pursue somebody to actually sell their work with. In my opinion, going from the business world, this is relatively simple. It's like, if I'm a person with a store, I need things in my store to sell. This is the relation between a producer and or a presenter or a venue and a creator. So basically, producer, presenter, and venue are one thing. There is the creation part, there's the selling part of the art, and then there's the buying part of the art. For me, it's literally like that. Patron is the buying part. Selling part is, how is the business model set up to sell? Is it a repertory company that is selling on a subscription basis, or is it a festival that has 3 days, something going on? That really goes at the core of the business model. And the creators are always the people who are making the things. It's like, if you are a Subway store, you need to order your sandwiches and your bread and your sausages and your cheese and your salad from someone. So the producers of the salad and the cheese are the people who make those things, and you are buying it. I think here where we make a problem is that we want the person who is a farmer seeding salad also be the store who does the salad, and also be the marketer of that store and the logistics for that store. Those are too many roles for a person to have knowledge in or have the time and resources in. That is where we really leave it out, and it's extremely confusing for coming from a different country to understand that.
Yeah, there's lots to learn. Absolutely. And the Canadian system grew up in the 50s, basically, 1950s. Before that, we would just have British art or American art, right? There was no Canadian sort of story that was prevalent at all. So this very much has been driven by nation building concerns, not necessarily the same driver as in other places, right? And it's created a system, right? That isn't particularly organic, I would actually suggest, but it's created, and this is what we've got. And we fund, Canada Council funds creation. We all know this. At some point, they realized that the chain is bigger than just creation, than just playwrights writing plays. So they have all kinds of programs now in terms of production, and a little tiny bit around presentation. Right, they're presenting stuff that's funded through provinces and the federal government far more so. Totally different streams, totally different relationships, quite distinctive. And what I want to show you is really this view. So this is the digitized art view. So all of a sudden, producers and venues are gone. This is one of the challenges we have, right? Because it is actually possible in the digital world. One of the things that's happened in the digital world is that the go-to-market process, I think somebody said this earlier, the go-to-market process can be far more direct. I can be a writer in front of my audience instantaneously by publishing a thing on my blog.
But then it's a blog, it's not a theater piece or a play, right? That is the difference.
No, I'm not. But I can stick a camera in front of my face, and I can, have a theatrical rendition of something I want, right? Yes. But also say your access to your patrons, right, doesn't have to go through a presenter's lens and a venue lens as entities, as organizations, right? You can actually access, or what feels like access, your audience directly. But what I wanted to point out, importantly, is that is actually not true. There are mediators in this world, and they're called internet service providers, and they're called presentation platforms. So the questions we all have been grappling with is, initially everybody used Facebook Live 2 years ago because it was available and there were lots of people on Facebook. So Facebook Live is the answer. YouTube, favorite choice of channel to put your free performances onto, right? They existed, they have massive usership. Those are presentation platforms. I want to be really clear on that. So who benefits from artists putting their free shows onto Facebook Live?
Facebook does.
More than anybody else.
Yeah.
When I put them on YouTube, who benefits? Well, YouTube does. How do they benefit? They monetize basically because those eyeballs, quite literally, watch advertising or are exposed to advertising, and that's what they monetize. That's their model. It's like newspapers. Newspapers never made enough money through the editorial or news reporting content They created content in order to sell advertising, which is how the model got supported. Right? So this is one of the challenges, right? Because what digital does, it actually disrupts this value chain that we're used to. Even if it's the same person doing it, the functions are quite different. And Andrea, this is an interesting conversation, right? To hear your perspective on that. Because just because this is the way in Canada, absolutely, this is not necessarily the best way to organize ourselves. Or the most effective or most efficient or anything like that. But this is essentially what it is. And I'm not even addressing union labor here and how, you know, how you can have, you know, set designers as a producer or as a presenter or maybe as a venue. Like there's a bunch of functions that cross over, in fact, right? It's not so tidy. So I am aware that part of what I'm showing you is a concept here. Part of what I'm also showing you here, if you look at that patron piece at the end here, there is a notion here about, you know, the customer, the patron consumes the art and they buy tickets to do that, but they may see themselves as a customer of the venue or the presenter or the producer, right? It's not so straightforward. And depending on, you know, the brand that somebody has, you know, the theater venue might be incidental, but the presenter that is presenting the work might be really important. So I don't know, a bad example perhaps, but Broadway across Canada, right? They're a presenter, they're a promoter presenter. The theaters they go into are incidental to the Broadway shows they bring. Right, the strength comes from that. While in other cases, you know, when you're at the National Arts Center or at the Stratford Festival or at Shaw or something like that, those have massive brands as venues, right, where there's a different relationship. But you also realize quickly, because those do both production and presentation, that it gets murky real fast, right? The lines are not so clear cut. But this is interesting to me. I want to point this out because the customer relationship is actually an important thing to think about. And even in the real world, the patron may have a different view of, you know, whose customer they are. You know, I go to see certain theater by that playwright because, or by that director, because I think they're brilliant. That's more a Quebec scenario usually, where they have a far different system in place. Here, the patron relationship, you know, the patron doesn't necessarily feel they have a relationship with Facebook or YouTube. I think the relationship opportunity here is far more direct, going straight to the producer. And what it challenges our colleagues who own venues and who have been exclusively acting as presenters, their place in this digital world, you know, requires a lot of thought. It requires a lot of consideration. Because arguably, and I should tell you that this is primarily the kind of organizations I've been working with in the last 10 years or so, 15 years, have been presenters, right? And I'm keenly aware how difficult it is for them to figure out this digital world, especially when they've been primarily presenting touring work, touring artists. Because there's really no reason for me to see the same touring artist 60 times because they have 60 venues across the country. I just want, as an audience member, I just want to see the best show. I want to see the one show, right? I don't need a repetition of that. So it's a very challenging piece for the presenting organizations to figure out. Their role essentially is that the theater as a platform, the physical theater as a, like that the stage as a platform is being usurped by the digital platforms, right? Now, I have lots of opinions about, you know, what presenters should be doing and could be doing, because they still have an incredible access to audience that is intrinsic to this, to their role, but it tends to be geographically bound. So the relationship piece is complex to sort out how you can leverage that. While from a creator producer, from that side of it, you know, you can be very happy to all of a sudden generate direct access to an audience. But we have to understand the two intermediaries you now deal with. Your ISP, as well as your audience members' internet service provider, can create a really discontinuous experience if you have terrible internet speeds. Speed is the biggest issue, right? Video requires at least 3G internet. Satellite internet's not necessarily adequate quite yet for that. But also the presentation platforms that we gravitated towards were the ones that existed, and they're big multinationals who can leverage that incredibly while the producing companies don't generally. So that is part of where, you know, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about some of the Canadian projects that are trying to address that a little bit more. Things like SideDoor, in terms of music, well, any kind of show, basically, they morphed into that, or some of the business-to-business applications that are emerging as well, or the public place network, which would be an alternative, but still harder to get into than a YouTube, right? So there's lots of challenges on business models, lots of challenges on digital business models for all of these entities. Is this a sort of at least an interesting conversation in terms of how maybe we need to think about how this digital value chain is different and how it advantages or disadvantages, potentially advantages or disadvantages different players in the bricks and mortar ecosystem?
I think it's still problematic on the grounds that if we are presenting in any version of 3D multiple humans, we then have to have a physical venue. We have to have a bricks and mortar venue and do the thing in a bricks and mortar to whatever degree we wish to. And it's challenging to do that. It's very difficult to put any kind of performative art on without being in a physical place in this, what we do at the moment, unless you're going to make a different art form. And, you know, moving towards making things, which is obviously one of the solutions to the issue. And then, you know, so it's just spectacularly more expensive because you have to pay all of the costs that you had to originally pay. And then should you choose to try and monetize it across the hybrid format, it has a cost factor in there. So you have to raise enough money to pay for that digital piece before you present it. That is then the circuit of trying to get your new different other audience from other sectors, which could potentially down the line get you coin. And how do you en route get to there?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm keenly aware of, can't remember if the conversation was the other day that we might have had, even Eileen, as part of our free-for-all session the other day. But what I'm keenly aware of is that there are several organizations, arts organizations in the world that have embraced the digital world back in 2007. Who are they? The Berlin Philharmonic has created a digital concert hall that has been operating since 2007 as a partnership with, I think it was Sony. So a technology partner was required to make that go. What's another organization that we all know that has gone digital? The Metropolitan Opera in New York, offering their operas live in cineplexes around the world. 60 countries, I think, was the highest I'd seen at some point. I haven't sort of tracked where both of those projects are at, except I know that both offered their stuff for free for a short moment in March 2020. Normally, this is a fairly decent ticket price. Do you know whether those are viable business models for these organizations?
Yes, they are, but there's a very significant problem to it. It comes to scale.
Yes.
So Berliner Philharmonic annual budget is 50 million Canadian dollars. So in this world, basically, we turn the whole world into where there are YouTubes and Googles and Berliner Philharmonics and NT and etc. or MoMA or so large organizations where, because they have a larger budget in infrastructure, administration, personnel, they have a better chances of securing a larger partner like Sony. Like if you're Eileen or me go ask Sony to be a partner, that's going to be a tall order. So basically here is the big scratching the back to the big, and it's killing the market for the rest. So the economies of scale in digitalization literally create this polarization and classism that we talk about. Like what kills the middle, it's literally disruption. That's its whole intent. And with it comes the killing of the middle class as well, because you basically have a bunch of people in the bottom who are servicing this, and then you have the ownership of assets. And in this case, the asset is the intellectual property. That is where it comes down to. And Sony's interest in Berliner Philharmonics is not the music, it's the fact that they are a brand. that is what they're really interested in. It's the marketing
That is correct.
behind everything, not anything else. It's the fact that they already have access to market, and that Sony can then test certain products on a market that they know exactly what it is. It's basically data harvesting on a massive scale that then creates massive, massive products. In Europe, there has been a lot of pushback towards that in the previous years. So now there is law passed in France where Google and Facebook actually have to pay for content that they publish of any sort. And the reason for these changes has been exactly that, because this digitalization started in 2007. Like I remember when Slovene companies were doing that. But very quickly, it became clear to all of us that basically we're just selling ourselves short. Here's someone who is now taking rather than paying for it. And we put a stop to it through some very deliberate law actions. We haven't any plans in North America for any of these legal actions being the case yet. We are just giving it free roll for the search engines to post whatever they want and still act as not being publishers, so not being subject to any legislation in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like the sort of Canadian content on Netflix and is an example of trying to begin to grapple with those very challenges, right? Because Canadian content is a thing, CanCon is a thing. And we don't talk about that nearly as much in the digital world, right? And CanCon is a thing because Canada likes to have its own identity, right? It's back to nation building, back to that conversation, right? And we see quickly how incredibly hard it is to try to legislate companies that are residing in other countries. Right? It's very, very difficult, and it requires these international, like there's a superstructure of international law that is incredibly complicated to get anything done. So notwithstanding this very astute analysis, I entirely agree in terms of, the haves and have not part of that. The issue is digital scale. So what do Berlin Phil and the Met have in common? They are considered by many to be maybe amongst the top 2 brands in their field in the world. Right? So Vienna would be the maybe number 1 to most people. And perhaps, I don't know, in opera, who would it be? Maybe Milan. Right? The Scala in Milan. So if you're not one of those top 2 brands in the world, do you even stand a chance by yourself? And the answer is no, you don't. So here's the real question then. What is the opportunity in niche disciplines such as, let's say, puppetry, or even Canadian theater, or even, right, or Canadian dance, to like relatively small artistic disciplines? As, like if I think of them as, the economic side of it, I'm not talking about at all the social value or the cultural value that gets generated. It's really about the economics that I'm talking about, right? Because those other values are actually really important in many of your business models too. But your issue is sustainability around that, right? So the economic piece tends to keep putting you into that train of thought. And I think, so that is part of, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen for a moment with you. So part of my question, I think part of what's cool about this project that Aline and your colleagues have been, the partnership has been sort of creating, is we're actually talking together. So while individually we don't really have a pitch in this digital world to build bona fide business models where there is a creation, exchange, and capture of value, dollars, value, right? That would be a bona fide business model. So I think, that question of, can I do it on my own? I think the answer is pretty apparent, unless you become the Met of puppetry, and puppetry becomes at least as popular as opera, which is, as we know, a challenged art form, or classical music, which feels it is a challenged art form from an audience standpoint. And then, so what does it take? What do we actually need to do in the performing arts, in the Canadian performing arts, or in a slice of it, such as, multidisciplinary creators and producers, not just yourselves, people who use puppetry or are puppeteers, and that's most of what you do, to actually break through and monetize and generate revenue in this digital world? right? I mean, that's at heart of a lot of what we're trying to figure out. And so what I would like to observe with you is that the digital business models that succeed, which ones are they? Affiliate marketing, yeah, perhaps. That would be one angle. The question is, what do we market? Right? So do we market, live shows for each other? That's an easy thing to do, and we will feel supportive of each other. Or do we market digital expressions where we might feel the constraint of, where we might feel a different constraint? So one of the things I would like to point out is that by and large, the digital business models that succeed are platforms. Facebook is a platform. They're not a content creator or maker. They are a platform that distributes and creates access to content. YouTube, everybody does user-generated content. Remember that buzzword? Well, user-generated content is awesome for the platform that houses it and can monetize it through advertising. But is that user-generated content awesome for the content creator? Can they monetize it, right? The barriers to monetization are incredibly high on a YouTube. So platform ownership is the key in many digital business models. Amazon didn't warehouse the books, didn't stock the books. There was nobody who had to physically move the asset called a book in the Amazon universe. They simply had a computer that created a sale transaction. The order went to the publisher. The publisher handled all that work, right? And it cut out the bookstore, the bookseller in the middle. And we can have a big, long conversation about what we lose in that process, right? The point is, it is simply a reality and a fact at this moment in time. So I am very interested in, sort of this platform conversation, because if we believe this, if you believe my supposition to be true, how does it change the actions that we need to take as arts organizations, as makers of creative works, as producers and presenters of creative works? And how is our relationship with each other? If by chance we're three different entities, which can happen, how does our relationship to each other evolve to actually strengthen and support the arts ecology? Because we still need the physical venues too, right? But if the pie changes, and the pie might be bigger, as you saw earlier in my little graphic of live arts and how live arts becomes part of a bigger pie, but apart, and it may or may not be a smaller aspect to that, hard to tell. We don't really know until past COVID, and this digital plays out a little bit of exactly how large the pie will be. That new pie that people with live performing art skills, will generate for themselves. But I am aware, right? So if platforms are where the money is, and where the aggregation of revenue happens, what does that mean to us?
I would argue that it means very little to us, because these platforms are run by people from the tech universe who have degrees and specialized knowledge in the field of coding. So it's not just as simple as it's a platform. Well, there's a lot of proprietary coding that goes into making that business model work, and also the tech behind it to function properly. Like for any of these startups, it costed multiple millions of dollars injections before they got anywhere close to earning any. And Amazon's business model was not necessarily disruptive because of removing the warehouse. It was disruptive really because of the finance. When do they receive the money from the product, and when do they pay it out to the actual producer? They extended this day from 5 days to 2 weeks, which was before at the largest companies, to 65 days, which allowed them to invest the money for the 50 days in between and generate additional revenue. So basically Amazon became big because they were a financial company rather than being just a technological company. And I'm maybe a pessimist in that way, but I'm not sure if artists with trying to do everything that we already are forced to do also have the time to now learn how to code, how to also create the next startup. Because to create a digital startup today, it's almost practically impossible. And you have to be a coder. Like it's just doesn't happen without that. So if we all start coding, then we can code a platform where we can host things. But that will still not be enough, because finding an audience for that platform is really where the challenge is. You can make the best platform on the planet if you don't have people coming to watch it. That's the challenge.
Absolutely. So there's a few issues that, that come up right away. One is, the issue is actually not who codes. I can hire them, right? The issue is who owns. And the issue in ownership, I would propose, is about what are the intentions of that owner. And if my intentions are primarily to, world domination, economically speaking, short form for that, let's say Amazon or Facebook, like their userships is bigger than countries, right? Their revenue is larger than the majority of countries on Earth in terms of their GDP, right? They're clearly incredibly powerful players. And they thrive on that private benefit being generated. Even if they're publicly traded, it still essentially becomes a private benefit that gets concentrated, as you're describing very astutely, in very few hands. And they're doing that based on, creative works or any works, or me just posting my dinner, right? And all of that content, me posting my dinner, becomes equivalent to a professionally produced, theatrical experience in that world. It's complete. It doesn't actually care, right? So the ownership and the intention of ownership, I would propose, matters a great deal in the digital world, because when we're disrupting the way that sectors are organized, there's always winners and losers. We're seeing this with COVID really clearly, and incredibly painfully. So what does it take to be on the winner's side? Do I have to, claw my way across a bunch of bodies to do that? Or can we figure out, right, truly figure out how to collaborate and how to generate ownership of a thing that has different intentions? So this is where we talk a lot about social enterprise. That concept of a social enterprise actually wanting to do good while being structured as a for-profit business. That's what a social enterprise is, as opposed to what many arts organizations are, which is that you're not for profit intrinsically, sometimes even charitable, because you're doing that kind of good in the world. But much of your business is operating in a for-profit context. Very, very difficult, right? And that's part of why all of the arts organizations, I feel, are so stressed, right? Because how you're structured and what you operate in actually doesn't jive super well. Mm-hmm. And you forever have to justify your existence to your not-for-profit charitable funders, which doesn't actually help you do the work that you really need to do, and that I want artists to do, that I want, people who society invests so much in to be our best thinkers and reflectors, and reflecting back on us and reflecting back on society. There's so much value there, right? And instead I make you be marketers and technologists and coders. This is an intrinsic problem in all of this, right?
It comes down to business problem of the asset ownership and what everybody here is expected to be, because this pressure on the funders and why you have to constantly justify yourself is the imbalance between the amount of people entering the field and creating new companies. Like the business model that exists in the rest of the world is that the asset, the venue, is owned by the city or the state or the province. And then the city, the state, or the province employs the artists in there. But the company, the entity, owns their work. So the work is not individually owned. When I, as a director, work for a theater, I sell my rights completely. I have no rights to it after. If they want to sell it to a TV, it's not mine, it's theirs. That creates a higher social security for myself, because I can sell my cupcake to the restaurant and negotiate how much I want for that cupcake. So my product pricing, it's really clear. It creates a higher social security. And there is a balance between how many people are then entering this versus how many people are succeeding something. It's a supply and demand problem. Here, we have more pressure on the funders because we're creating more and more people who are working in the field, which creates a higher level of competition where people have to kick each other out, or the funder needs to reduce the amount of funding in order to have it accessible to all. So it's a classic business model supply problem.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, right? And and I think, who knows who's coming back to the live performing arts once COVID is truly and well over in terms of, you know, the way we relate. And once we all get over our fears that have been instilled, right? So there's not going to be when the restrictions are lifted, it's going to be sometime later that some whatever, you know, version of normal appears again, where we're actually comfortable to rub shoulders in a theater with strangers, right? But I think, you know, that's the conversation we need to have, right? Because in many ways, you are being pushed in the last few years to figure out digital, right? Canada Council has created an incredible fund, an incredible resource in that fund around digital exploration, taking digital risks, figuring it out. One of the things that I've observed is that in the first few years of that 4-year experiment, most of the funding went to digital literacy.
Mm-hmm.
What digital literacy is, and the reason why I got into that with a 3-year-long project around digital literacy in the performing arts is because I've found that that I wasn't finding partners to have the conversation with, which is this conversation in part we're having today around, you know, the issues of platforms in the digital realm and their power, and how do you as a maker or creator or producer actually play in that world in a way that doesn't just extract from you all value, but gives you nothing back. It doesn't allow you to, you know, fill your fridge or pay your rent or any of those things, right? So I got into digital literacy just to enable people to have the conversation. That's fascinating to me, right? Because meanwhile, people are developing VR applications, and they're trying to figure out, you know, holography and how the holograms and how they actually might work in a real way, not in a fake way. You know, there's a lot of fake versions of it using ghosting techniques from theater, as it turns out, where Mariah Carey can be on 5 stages at the same time, seemingly, right? But not as a hologram, just looks like one from the right angles, right? Because that evolution in the digital realm is happening whether we're participating or not. And one of the challenges we have seen in all sectors that have been disrupted through digital technologies is that the bricks and mortar part of it tends to lose. It tends to lose, or maybe it just tends to lose out in some fashion, right? And that's, you know, so my question and part, my motivation in part is to say, what would it take for us to not be at the receiving end of that change, being the ones that are disrupted, but what would it take for us to actually figure out how to disrupt it in a way that serves the arts ecology, not technology companies and their owners who are predominantly predicated on extracting revenue from whatever they encounter, right? And keeping it, not sharing it. Spotify, you know, well known for not sharing. iTunes, all of those services in music are well known for the impact they're having on actual musicians, right? What would it take for us not to have that same experience for what we consider the more kinetic type disciplines that you're working in?
But I'm going to make now the devil's advocate.
Please, go for it. Yes.
do we have the chance to attempt that? Is there even value in that? Because on one hand, like, do we want to battle YouTube or Facebook and create a new Facebook or new YouTube? Or can we just use the existing platform and become the influencer that makes money because of that platform, right? Because there are two separate things. The platform is a tech business. The influencer is the creative business. What these platforms have created, in addition to already gaming and VR and stuff that existed, it's an additional content. Basically, what we are all now competing for is the time of the day of a person. Like, if a person spends 5 hours a day consuming content, we are just another piece of the pie of consuming that content. So we need to get infinitely better at what is our content, and also who is our audience members and what is the need of that audience. We'll have to become niche. Same like you have someone on YouTube who's, I don't know, take on things is I'm showing people how to organize my closet, and that's their thing. I think theater will also have to become specialized. But on the other hand, it also makes me feel, are we basically making the cry of a glove maker at the end of the 20th century? You know, are we the glove maker who is going out of fashion because no one wears gloves anymore? And for the last 2,000 years, everybody wore gloves, and now nobody will? Maybe that's the case too.
Well, and you know, the field in which you have chosen to work, arguably, is an absolute requirement for humanity.
Mhm.
I would argue, and you might too, that it's at the level of food and shelter and clothing. Right? Creative expression has been intrinsic to what we consider a human to be. Now, the problem is, I can make theater too, even though I'm not a theater artist. Like there's a very egalitarian way in which we all can, take whatever instrument, including my desk or something, and I become a percussionist. Right? There's a lot of self-generation around that, and specialization, along with industrialization, right? Specialization creates industries, right? So while the art arguably is actually quite fine at this time, the artistes, right? The specialized modes of creation, production, all of that, that's what's challenged, right? And I think that's something we also can think about. I think your observation is correct. I spent a part of my career. I'm a marketing researcher, right? I'm a strategist. I don't work in the arts. I work with the arts. And as a marketing researcher back in the early 2000s, when online surveying became a thing, we realized quickly, and that industry changed completely how it operates. It had to. But one of the things that people have realized in those last 20 years of that digital disruption is the companies that do well in the world are multinational research companies, very, very big ones, or independent researchers with very, specialized knowledge like myself. So yeah, either super macro or you're super micro,
Yeah.
right? I do very well in my business. Ipsos Reid does very well in its business. Yeah. The companies that have been most challenged are the regional research houses, even national in Canada, because Canada is small, even national houses have been under incredible pressures. Trying to figure out how to survive in this world because they don't get scale. I don't need scale, right? As an independent, I need expertise. And hey, we can have a really great jam, and Eileen found me and we've met before, and there's a relationship and it's real and we actually know each other. We actually care, right? So I don't need scale to work. I need expertise and relationships. A multinational has scale. It doesn't have to have great relationships because it has scale. It will always beat you on price, and it has really great staff, right? So they'll do the diligent, correct work. But that's become so commodified, right? That it's really hard if you don't have that massive scale. I think similar dynamics is what you're alluding to here, right? Where if you're so small that really what you need to focus on, your answer as a small entity might be, you know what, I am going to build these powerful relationships with particular smaller markets, but they're so committed that they actually support me at the level I need them to.
Yeah.
And that is a very astute digital response, right, in this world. That it actually may make you do nothing digital other than marketing, because you still need to reach your audience and you still need to build that engaged relationship or committed relationship. And digital will be part of that. Absolutely it will. No way it's not. But you're not worried about digital production, digital presentation, digital archiving, digital anything apart from just the marketing aspect of it. And I think that will serve a range of organizations. I think that's true. But I think there's also this other piece of it where if other organizations at slightly larger scales are simply going to disappear, what is the cultural loss? What is the social loss? What is the loss of diversity of opinions? There's a lot of societal impacts around that we have not fully considered, that we insist upon, but we haven't fully considered how not to let that happen, is what I'm trying to say. And I think in that conversation, that piece about, what is the problem I'm solving and what are the issues and challenges that get in the way? And in between, what you see on the screen here is one way to build a business model. Right, that there's a sort of business model canvas, and the rest of the presentation actually, there's like 3 more slides that give you a little bit more narrative about what each of these things are. But I think that is actually sort of the hard conversation that's been incredibly difficult to galvanize, despite all the funding for digital innovation that's around right now. Because of, there are lots of reasons for that. But so that's, kind of where I want to leave the conversation today, because it's probably as far as we can get in an hour and a half anyways. Part of what I would like you to feel walking away from this is that there's no single answer that holds for every organization. I think, Andrea, you're making that really an astute argument around that. But you are challenged to figure it out in a new and different way. That's right. And I think, you can have a great practice in this scenario. I don't think there's an intrinsic barrier to that. But you actually have to think about it and understand how that is. And it has to be a conscious choice, because right now, part of what happens, a lot of arts organizations I speak with, they're told to figure it out. They're told to become digital. They're told that somehow they need to digitize the arts. And it's like, no, actually, that's not the point. I don't need to see the same touring musician 60 times. That is not going to happen. Right. So the conversation needs to not be so simplistic, because this world isn't that simplistic. And I do think that different answers for different people actually can make perfect sense. Anyway, we're at the end of our hour and a half together, which is kind of amazing. Any closing comments from anybody before we say goodbye for today?
I think the other thing is to remain energized and positive amidst this, because it does sap so much energy, and all of us are still trying to do whatever we're trying to do in the first place.
Yep.
So the need to actually find community, and as you speak to, and I think that is the intent of this. Yep. So that we can, and look for intersections where we can deal with infrastructure and, duplication and the like of whatever's possible to do that. And then again, where is the will in the country to address other opportunities, other models, other ways to fund things? And seemingly this putting of a large amount of money into the digital sphere there seemed to have been, money came out of somewhere to pile in that pile. So, again, how does the will shift that the arts are perceived to be of value? And, the conversations around COVID about what did you do while you were locked in your house as you dealt with art all day long? So how do we shift that paradigm and keep visioning, instead of all the things we don't have, all the things that we do and you need and you could, and you return that value for what it does for your heart?
Yeah, these are very, very important conversations and great questions to think about and mull. And on one hand, it's a difficult time, but on the other hand, it's also an exciting time in what all of these things are bringing. I think it's also a listening time, that like we're kind of forced into the listening time for the audience response, because more than ever with this digital connection, we have an instant response, whether the audience connects to it or not, and we can actually ask them what they connect to. So maybe it challenges the content itself too. Like if we don't have people showing up, maybe we have to ask ourselves, is that content needed? Which I know it's a very difficult question that we don't want to ask ourselves sometimes, but that's kind of what this model now directly pushes us towards too.
It's I'm not seeing a lot of comfortable spaces in this sort of exploration at all. Like everything pushes you outside of where you've been working, where the comfort has been, where the known quantities are just, there's a lot more unknowns in this, and it's very uncomfortable. It's also necessary. And there's many, like there's a lot of issues that get tied up in all of this, including equity, diversity, and inclusion issues in the digital realm. I mean, there's a lot of, very unintended consequences that happen about who gets amplified, who doesn't, just like in the physical world. but it can actually do that more rapidly in a very inequitable way, right? So there's lots of additional issues and things that we actually do need to contemplate as well, if we want this to be a human experience worth having, right? And I think that is part of the equation there. We're repeating this conversation on Saturday one more time, live. So we'll see who shows up then. And we'll use the same, model of information, but the conversation always shifts to whoever's having the conversation with us. So it'll be an interesting Saturday at a moment as well. And then we have a couple more workshops lined up for in a week from now and on March 9th to explore in a little bit more detail some of these issues around digital revenue generation and what does that actually mean, and some of the tools that are available now that are Canadian innovations, often funded through the Digital Strategy Fund, but not always, to try to start to build a digital infrastructure that people can use that isn't predicated on just extracting value from the art sector, but giving it back to it as well. So that's going to be an interesting part of the next few weeks that we'll talk about a bit more as well. Thanks so much for your time today. It's really good to see you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much.